Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be back in Perth. It's really nice to be not on a plane. Nice to be grounded again. It's a shame we don't have windows here, isn't it? Because don't you just love the Swan River? Isn't that just beautiful? I'll just pay my respects to the Noongar people of WA and the custodians of this beautiful country that we're on today, and thank Auntie Marie for that beautiful welcome. Don't you just love hearing Noongar language? That's the language of this earth. That we should all be proud of that, whether you're Aboriginal or not. We should all be proud that this is one of the oldest languages in the world. Isn't that fantastic? That we can actually claim that. That's wonderful. And also pay my respects to any elders in the room today and my colleagues. I'm sure there are some familiar faces. I've seen a few already this morning. It's nice to be back in familiar territory. I'm really glad to be able to present today. It's really hard to condense 35 years of work into half an hour or 25 minutes, but I'll do my best. I also, just before I start, want to pay my respects to all of the survivors that came to us in the Royal Commission, and just to acknowledge their strength and courage and determination in coming to us to make the world a safer place for children. It was both a profoundly disturbing and incredibly inspiring experience over the past 5 years. So I just acknowledge their enormous effort in making our work possible. Okay, I hope this works. So yes, it's working good. All right, so this is me and my family. So that's my grandmother holding my mum, and that's me holding my first child. A bit younger then, a bit slimmer. I'm waiting for the day when you can have your avatar on stage and you can sit down in the audience. You can design it however you like. You can look really, really good. But anyway, and look, just to remind us that basically it's all about relationships. And if one of the things that came out from a lot of the stories that we heard in the Royal Commission, and also in the work I've done in clinical work, is that we just don't live in isolation. We don't exist in isolation. All of us exist within relationships. And one of the things that kept survivors coping as children throughout their awful experiences in care and throughout the institutions they found themselves in was having a long-term, strong, supportive relationship with someone who believed in them. And unfortunately for many of our children, because of the shortened life expectancy we still have and our lack of elders, a lot of our kids miss out on having that really strong, supportive relationship. In fact, a young person recently said that they had 70 placements in out-of-home care. I don't even know how you could even develop any sort of relationship if that's the sort of life that you have in a care experience. And also to remind us that if we're going to have generational recovery, then we have to know who our generations are. And one of the things that we also found with the Royal Commission, and I'll get onto this in a minute in regard to the Aboriginal population, is the generational fragmentation in family structures. And we don't know how to put that back together. We really don't. And I'm just fortunate that in my own family we've been able to put that back together, but for many families that's been an impossible task. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Have we really understood the magnitude of what happened in Australia to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and children in particular? Can we really address the vulnerability of children in isolation from family, community and culture, and from that generational history of trauma? And have we really understood the value, strength and importance of culture, Aboriginal knowledge systems and healing practices? So hopefully we'll have a little bit of a think about that as I go through the presentation today. This is actually a story really about what happened historically, and I'm not going to go through that just because we only have a short period of time. But if we look at where we are in regard to healing from generational trauma, what stage are we at? We're not there yet. We're far from there. We have a long way to go. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And yet we're in a modern era where people are asking us to get over it. We haven't even got to a healing stage, a proper healing stage yet, so how can we get over it? So I just want to bear that in mind. I also want to just emphasise as well the importance of the bearing of witness. One of the things that many, many survivors told us in the Royal Commission was that when they came and spoke to us, this was a pivotal moment. This was a life-changing event for them. I never expected it to be that powerful. I've heard many, many disclosures and services, but this was a very different bearing of witness that we did in the Royal Commission. And people found that it gave them the space to be heard, to be heard to be heard properly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so it allowed the opportunity for change and a pivotal moment to occur. We don't do that very well in services. We don't listen with a full brain, we listen with half a brain, and the rest of the brain is doing risk assessment and stupid screening tools that are useless anyway. Sorry, that's just a particular dislike I have. But we don't. And so there was a wonderful experience within the Royal Commission to actually listen with the whole person. And I think that's why partly it was a powerful process for people. We haven't done the truth-telling in Australia. We've had reconciliation without the truth, and we've just sort of moved on and forgotten about it. So we have to think about the power of bearing witness, the power of enduring relationships, which was clearly a really important resilience factor for people, and also the issues around safety. Is it safe to heal yet? Is it safe to continue to tell these stories? So this is where we came from. This is the Aboriginal map of Australia. I've taken the X marks the spot from where my group is, but it's up in the Pilbara there, Palka people. So we went from this to this. This is where we all got moved into. And look at WA. 167 institutions. There were some institutions, some missions, and New Norcia's one, for example, that operated for over 100 years. How many generations of removal is that? Does anybody in this room, I know a lot of you are clinicians, does anybody in this room know how to heal 5 generations of removal and trauma in a family system? So if you take one woman who was in a mission that we took the story from, their mother and grandmother were in the mission, and their daughter and granddaughter were removed into out-of-home care, how do you heal that? So we don't know how to do it. We haven't understood magnitude to that extent to know how to do it. So what we do is we have a scattergun approach and we throw things at it, but we haven't actually done the basic framework of healing to understand how this is going to work into the future. If we look at the historical context, it forms into 3 parts. So we had sustained trauma and helplessness. If you listen to some of the stories of what people experienced on the missions, they were pretty horrific. Very, very horrific. Lots of abuse, lots of beatings, lots of other forms of abuse, all forms of abuse, in fact. And over generations and over many, many years. We had extreme forms of grief and loss and disconnection and fragmentation over generations. And we had extreme forms of powerlessness. So even for those families who tried to keep their kids, if they tried to protest, often they were put in jail. So there was no redress for parents to be able to hold on to their children. So that sense of loss of control and the denial and deprivation again occurred over generations. The Bringing Them Home report clearly states this was genocide. Why don't we use that term? We're not healing from intergenerational trauma. We are healing from the impact of genocide. And I just want to make that clear. If we say we're healing from intergenerational trauma, it sounds like we're blaming our old people for passing trauma on. They didn't pass trauma on, this was imposed. So we are healing from genocide. We need to be very, very careful about the language that we use. We also know that it's cumulative over a person's lifetime, it's collective across community groups, and it's generational. In fact, some community groups, the whole group of children were removed in one foul swoop. If we look just briefly at some of the data from the Royal Commission, we heard about 8,000 private stories, 14% were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. We saw a lot of men, and I think the men's voice is partly missing in this story as well, because we failed them as children. If we just look at some of the data there as well, we did hear a lot of stories about the past, but we also heard some contemporary stories. But if you look at that second last dot point, 1/3 were sexually abused between 1 and 5 years. That's a really long time to be exposed to very, very severe forms of trauma. And of course it was multi-generational. So that index woman that I spoke about, with her mother and grandmother and children and grandchildren, all experiencing these same forms of trauma. It's not just about the removal, it's about what else happens. Impacts are complex and profound, they differ by individuals, they change over time, they're influenced by many factors, and of course there's ripple effects. And I'm not going to go into that, you're all clinicians, you should know about all of this stuff. I think we've actually failed to grapple with the impacts. And I just don't understand why we have this silly distinction that if you've been severely traumatised in children, you don't qualify for child and adolescent mental health services. Go figure. It's because you're not a diagnosis, you had an event. God, we could make up any diagnosis because we actually know that this stuff contributes to any form of psychiatric disability or diagnosis or illness across the lifespan, not just in childhood, but in youth, in adolescence, in adults and in older age. And yet we just fail to actually even grapple with it at all. About time we got very real about this. We also heard in private sessions, in fact, although we've got that data there saying 94% or nearly 95% identified impacts on mental health, I think everybody really did identify impacts on mental health. It's probably 100%. But it also impacted on all domains of development. And one of the points I want to make today is about school. We have a lot of kids in schools who are very traumatised. Do we know how to educate a traumatised brain? I don't think we've grappled with that yet either. What we do is we put in aids, or we get them diagnosed with ADD and medicate them, or we do something else with them, expel them. But do we know how to educate them? Because we now know all of the neurodevelopmental impacts on the developing brain, and yet we don't factor that into teachers' education around how you actually do this in the educational setting. We don't want teachers to have to do everything. I understand that, they're there to educate. But if you don't know how to educate a traumatised brain, what are you doing? And all of the other support services need to get together on this. I do not see why we can't get child protection, mental health services and education together and work out how we do this well. There's no reason why we can't collaborate in this area. We also know that although all children are at risk by the nature of childhood, we know that Aboriginal children are at a greater risk in most of these institutions. And there was issues to do with racism and stigma and all these other sorts of things that went on. So there's an additional vulnerability because of the historical context of Australia. We know about the ACEs study, I'm sure you're all aware of that. If we don't address these adverse childhood experiences, we will never close the gap in chronic disease. We'll also never close the gap in terms of illness, mental illness either. And that's been well researched now. If we look at some of the other impacts, part of the reason of this historical legacy gives us this distorted population pyramid. So not very many elders. We've got a little bump in the middle-aged people now, but we've still got a lot of kids. Great, we've got a lot of kids, they're our future. But how do we grow them up well to be old people? Because that's how we're going to restore the population pyramid. Until we do that, we have to buffer families well enough because they don't actually have enough people around in order to do that. There was a fellow many years ago who said every child deserves to have someone crazy about them. And I believe that, I think that's right. But that was often the role of grandparents, and we're missing a whole pile of grandparents in our population group. So how do we substitute that? And these are all of the other impacts, of course. If we look at the historic trauma response that we see from overseas, then the first one, in terms of a response, is the restoration of traditional systems of belief and practice and the resurgence and reclamation of languages. How many languages do we teach? How many Aboriginal languages do we teach these days? We teach French, teach Indonesian. So we're not even at step one in terms of understanding what's required for recovery, and yet we're throwing millions of dollars into programs. So the current context is we're a post-genocide population in a post-colonial society. I still think we have a lot of double standards. There's still a lot of hypocrisy. We value wealth over people. And what is the role of government, services, society, and individuals? And in terms of the sort of services who are represented here today, you probably have a history that you may not be proud of in terms of your role in what happened to Aboriginal people. Certainly mental health services has a history that is not very good in regard to what we did with children and families. Child protection is the same, policing is the same. Education was very discriminatory in the early days as well. So we have a history that we've got to come to terms with, and we've got to get better at working out what we do now. And this is why language is so important. We have to absolutely own the past in order to move forward into the future. One of the things that survivors told us repeatedly when they came to speak to us is that they were constantly minimised. People minimise their experiences all the time in order to avoid it or deny it or to just reduce it. And that doesn't help. It's actually re-traumatising. So let's own the past, let's move on from it and get on with healing the future. So if we're going to look at healing, then we've got to look at what happened in terms of the magnitude of the trauma. How do we get that restoration of the self? How do we get that community resilience built up again? In fact, we had a lot of resilience in our community, which is why we've survived. We were made of pretty tough stuff and pretty clever stuff, I have to say. And as much as we were removed from family and culture and land, we couldn't be removed from spirit, which is one of the reasons why we actually did survive. There's plenty of stories about stolen generation, people being able to see ancestors, hear from ancestors, be visited by ancestors, which kept that connection alive. If we look at the levels of grief in communities, how do we actually repair the 5 generations of removal? We've now got a continuous line in my family, but how many families still have that fragmentation and continue to see the fragmentation? The current rates of child removal have gone up. We used to be about 6 times the rate, now we're 10 times the non-Indigenous rate of removals. It's getting worse. How do we turn that around back to a system where we're actually reconnecting people rather than removing? And then in terms of the powerlessness, how do we get that self-determination? How do we get that community governance built in? If we haven't addressed these 3 issues, then I don't know how you can throw money at suicide prevention programs if these things haven't been addressed, because what do you hang them on? They're just going to go into nothing. So we have to identify and rebuild strengths. We have to respond based on the 3 principles of responsibility, relationships and respect. We have to look at across the age groups and the generations. We can't just focus on the stolen generation, for example, because we've also got to rebuild the children. So we've got to do the here and now and also deal with the past at the same time. We can't prioritise one group over another. I'm a little bit tired that every policy group I go to or advisory group I go to, it's focused on adults. And that's not just in the Aboriginal population, that's in general. And I've got to keep saying, what about the kids? What about the kids? You know, we still end up being the poor cousins of funding. We had the apology. It was a good start. It did go some way to recognise what happened, although not fully, I don't believe. But what happened after that? It kind of, you know, we had the Healing Foundation, we had a few things that kind of got funded, but not in any big way. We then just moved into, what was it, practical reconciliation or something? Did anyone think that worked? Guess we'll see. So we have to go back and think about, well, what was the strength of our survival? What was the strengths of Aboriginal culture? Did we even recognise them? Because even today, we still have programs coming in from overseas and imposed on our communities that we then have to adapt and struggle with and try and evaluate and get a good outcome from. Let's stop doing that. Let's just agree to stop doing that and use the knowledge and the experience and the expertise and the programs that we've already developed from the ground up that we know work and build on the strengths. There's a good reason why we survived all of this. It's not because we're weak. It's because we're strong and we have a lot of knowledge. If you look at attachment systems, for example, we had the best, most comprehensive attachment system in the world. Bobby would have been very proud of us. Do we acknowledge that? No, we go and impose some other attachment model onto our communities instead. Why don't we look at what we've got and build on that? The autonomy and self-reliance that we have with children growing up is a really good thing. We had very, very good parenting skills. We should have been proud of the way we parented. Instead, we get non-Indigenous parenting programs imposed on our communities. And we had a lot of knowledge, we had a lot of humour, we had a lot of resilience in terms of how we survive things, and we had a lot of healing and ceremony. I'll give you one example from a traditional healer about how they might deal with trauma. I know I'm going to run out of time, anyway, I was going to keep going. I could actually keep you here all day, couldn't I? I might do that, just because, you know, I'm really passionate about this and I'm on a roll. No, I won't really. So with some of the healers I've worked with, one of them talked about when someone's experienced a lot of trauma, the trauma takes the form of a shape in the body and it resides somewhere in the body. And what the healer does is he allows or she allows the object to be removed through a spiritual way. And through that process, the person then feels like they can get that object out of their body. So they then don't own it and they can become free from the traumatic experience. That's just one example. Now, if you wanted to look at that in terms of a psychological model, it's externalisation. It's externalising the experience of the trauma, expelling it from your sense of identity and separating yourself out from the trauma story. And what we know about trauma is it disrupts the personal narrative and it stops you from having a coherent sense of who you are and your journey through life. So by being able to remove it or externalise it, you're able to move on or you're able to put it into a context as part of your experience but not your whole experience. Now, if the traditional healers try to explain that in a service model, it might be looked at that as mythical. But in actual fact, it has a complete parallel with modern psychotherapy. So it's not that we have these weird practices, they're actually based in good knowledge and good systems of care. The other thing that was interesting at a recent International Mental Health Conference I went to, I described what would be an Aboriginal mental health system. It was based on the principles that we developed for the Specialist Aboriginal Mental Health Service here in Perth that we developed, Michael Mitchell's service at Greylands some years ago. And I described all the elements and everyone said, we want that. We want that. So what you should really do is let mental health services be run by us. And you'll get a better service because it's more holistic, it's relationship-based, it acknowledges everyone as kind of family. I mean, would you trust or would you want many of your family members to go into our current mental health system? I wouldn't. I'd be really worried. But I might trust if it was an Aboriginal mental health system. So we have a lot of knowledge and we're not using it. And just in regard to children, We can embed children in an ecological framework. We can embed children in an understanding of their connection to land, to totem, to ancestry, to spirituality, to culture. That's good for everybody. I was working with a kid once whose totem was an eagle. So he was able to, every time he saw an eagle, feel a sense of strength. That's a really good thing. Wouldn't it be great if all kids had that sort of sense of connection? This is good for everybody, and it's within our own country. So you can use those traditional ways of embedding children in an ecological framework in terms of a psychotherapy model, which I believe is a really strong way to assist children and to help build their resilience, but also to provide them a sense of therapy that's outside of the normal 6 sessions of CBT which everyone gets offered, which I think is completely useless. So for connection for children, they're connected to spirit, which transcends time and space. For example, you can't ever get away from the mob because they're there waiting for you in spirit, which I think is fantastic. I think that's a wonderful thing, to think that you're always connected no matter what. That nature and totem are ever present. You can get a source of strength by that sense of connection that's all around you. What a wonderful thing to think that, that's my totem, that's my source of strength, I see it everywhere. I can look after that. That regardless of where you end up, as a teacher, a doctor, a lawyer, a commissioner, as someone who just stays at home and looks after children, it doesn't matter where you end up, you have a unique and irreplaceable part in Aboriginal culture because of the nature of custodianship and the nature of place and purpose in Aboriginal culture. So your story and continuity is there from many, many generations ago right through to many generations in the future. We just have to get over this bump that's in the middle right now. In terms of image, we would have had a lot of positive images reflected for Aboriginal kids in terms of their growing up. They were omnipotent, but now what children see as images are mostly negative. We've talked about that. Our young people talked about needing positive role models. But when our Aboriginal kids look at society, what images do they see? They see a lot of the negative still, or perhaps the only positive role model they see is footy players. I was a really slow runner. In fact, I have to admit, I'll confess a story here. In a running race at school once, I actually tripped over another girl so that I wouldn't come last. I'm very ashamed of that. So, we need these alternative, positive images that people can see themselves through. We don't want our kids to grow up with warped mirrors. We don't want our kids to think that trauma is normal. We want them to see that they could aspire to be anything. I'll just refer you to a document too. I'm part of the Australian Indigenous Doctors Association, and we celebrated 20 years in our organisation a little while ago. We now have hundreds of doctors and hundreds of Aboriginal medical students all throughout Australia, which is a great success story that hardly anyone knows about. But one of the things we did do is we did a publication called Pathways into Medicine. It's a little bit like the leadership journey that you've talked about, Colin. So that's available on our doctor's website if people are interested in having a look at that and promoting that to your kids and to the young people here today. If you want to do medicine, come and see me. If you want to be a child psychiatrist, even better. By the way, if you become a child psychiatrist, you get to buy the best Lego. It's really, really good. But we developed that as also to showcase the positive way forward. So we've got to get these images right. And remember the population pyramid? We've got to take the burden of care off our children. We need to give our children the chance to have the freedom to play, the freedom to imagine, and just to be able to be in their innocence before they grow up too quick. So children need strong, safe, enduring relationships with carers. They need strong culture, and we know strong culture and identity is protective for everybody. We need to have Aboriginal healing practices. They need to be part of the solution. In fact, they offer a lot of hope for other survivors and other children as well. They really do. We need to prevent the cascade of impacts over life. And we know that if we don't deal with trauma early in childhood, people are going to end up on drugs and alcohol, major mental health, major mental illness, criminality, jail. In fact, in the Royal Commission, we visited all the jails, all the maximum security jails throughout Australia, and I can honestly tell you, we failed every single one of those men as boys. And not just one system, multiple systems. And we need to have safe, nurturing childhoods because we know that if we don't, we'll never close the gap. So too many children are still falling from the nest. They're suffering trauma. Can we guarantee that they will have a safe place? I said this into the forum yesterday. One of the novel recommendations I made to the Commission was we should overfund children's services. Because if children have been through these experiences, we should give them the very best we can, not a fragmented, pathetic service that doesn't collaborate or connect with other services. And we don't need 20 visiting government cars to a single family. How will we achieve it? How does your service engage with the community? How does your service engage with that generational trauma that we've just talked about at the beginning? Have we even thought about how we might do that? I'm not going to talk to that, so I'm just going to finish because I've got 20 seconds left. So, we need to create the right story. How do we do that? We know how to do it. It's not rocket science, or as a footballer said, it's not rocket surgery. I think you got it mixed up a bit. But we actually really know how to do this, and we know how to do it really well. It has to be within strong relationships. It has to understand context. We have to understand what happened to us and stop blaming our older generations for what's happening now and understand what their life was like. It has to be through a cultural lens, otherwise it won't make sense and it won't resonate and it won't provide that resilience and strength that comes from culture. We have to get past trauma-informed care and actually have trauma competency. I can't believe we're saying we need a trauma-informed care approach in mental health services. We should be absolutely trauma competent. We need trauma specialists in schools, in juvenile justice, right across the board. We need it in child protection. We need to have a compassionate society, and we need to be able to listen to the stories with our full self and develop a human, compassionate response to these sorts of stories. And then we can have the story that we want to tell, which is once upon a time, all children in Australia grew up safe and nurtured and loved and achieved brilliance. Thank you.